We can never be free from the menace of promiscuous killings till the possession of firearms is everywhere restricted to persons of known character. To this end, I shall press my bill for passage through the United States Senate.
The Second Amendment guarantees the right of the people to keep and bear arms, creating a check against the government's overreach upon our other rights. The National Firearms Act of 1934 may be an infringement upon the right guaranteed by the Second Amendment by limiting the people's ability to access the tools necessary to exercise their responsibility to protect freedom without submitting to the government's registration and taxes. In 1934, gang violence was coming to its peak. Gangs and people such as John Dillinger, Al Capone, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, and many others terrorized the people of the United States, causing many problems for the American government. During this time, a man named J. Weston Allen gave testimony on H.R. 9066, saying that the only way to gain control of this country's problem with guns was to force the people to register them. This would mean that anyone possessing any type of gun would have to register, so the government could keep track of where the gun went. And if they didn't register, they would be forced into 5 years of jail time. After multiple discussions and revising, H.R. 9066 became what we know today as the National Firearms Act of 1934, also known as the NFA. This act limited access to machine guns, silencers, short-barreled shotguns, short-barreled rifles, and similar weapons used during the Prohibition era. It imposed a $200 tax upon the purchase of these weapons, as well as the requirement to register these weapons with the government. The hope was that this would keep these weapons out of the hands of criminals, but still allow law-abiding citizens to protect themselves. But, after this act was passed, many problems began to arise dealing with the restrictions set in place by it. About 5 years after the creation of the NFA, two men named Jack Miller and Frank Layton violated the NFA by carrying a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun across state lines. The court stated that the possession of a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun is not protected by the Second Amendment, but Miller appealed to the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court case United States v. Miller, the court ruled that the possession of a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun is not guaranteed by the Second Amendment. Additionally, crossing state lines made the violation fall under the NFA. James C. McReynolds ended this case by saying, "The purpose of the Second Amendment was to maintain effective state militias. Congress could require registration of a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun if carried across state lines." In D.C. v. Heller, D.C. decided that they were going to place a ban on the carrying of handguns for self-defense, the only exception of this being that police chiefs could issue a 1-year license in order to carry a handgun concealed. Heller, who was a special police officer authorized to carry a handgun while on duty, applied for a handgun he could use for self-defense at home. D.C. decided to deny his application. This led to Heller suing D.C. for infringing upon his rights stated in the Second Amendment. This case was later taken to the Supreme Court, where they ruled that the law in D.C. banning functional handguns at home was an infringement upon the Second Amendment, and that this law should be taken down. This case led to the definition of a well-regulated militia to be any able-bodied and willing man ready to serve his country in a moment's notice. In 2009, there had been several lawsuits filed against the city of Chicago because of their partial ban on handguns. The people said that these bans went against the ruling in D.C. v. Heller. The Seventh Circuit affirmed the district court's dismissal of the case, but the Supreme Court reversed that decision and held that these bans were a violation of the Second Amendment. They decided on this ruling because of what was said in D.C. v. Heller about the Second Amendment. They stated the protected activities of the Second Amendment were fundamental and deeply rooted into the history of our country. In 2016, a woman named Jamie Cayetano was carrying a stun gun in Massachusetts in order to protect herself from her abusive ex-boyfriend. The state of Massachusetts said that stun guns are not protected by the Second Amendment. After this ruling, Cayetano decided to sue the state of Massachusetts because she said they were violating her right to carry a stun gun in public for self-defense. The Supreme Court decided to take up the Cayetano v. Massachusetts case. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cayetano, saying that even though a stun gun was non-existent at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment, it is still protected by it. This restated what was said in D.C. v. Heller about guns that were non-existent at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment. Both of these rulings claimed that the Second Amendment extended to guns that were non-existent at the time of its writing. In this past year, another case arose about an issue with the meaning of what a machine gun really is. Bump stocks speed up the reloading and operation of semi-automatics by harnessing the energy of their recoil to manipulate the trigger into shooting at speeds similar to machine guns. The ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, said that bump stocks on semi-automatics weren't machine guns until after a mass killing in Las Vegas. Then they decided to classify bump stocks as machine guns. Cargill, after legally buying 2 bump stocks, was forced to surrender those 2 bump stocks under protest because of the new view the ATF had on bump stocks. Then Cargill decided to sue the ATF because they changed the definition of a machine gun. The Supreme Court ended up taking this case and ruling that a bump stock on a semi-automatic rifle was not a machine gun because the gun cannot fire more than one shot by the single function of the trigger. The NFA of 1934 has had a major impact upon what has happened with guns and the access to guns in the U.S. When it was first introduced, it was to protect the people from the gangs that were running rampant. Over time, the law has remained the same as society has evolved. There have been additions to this, such as the Gun Control Act of 1968 that stopped felons from possessing firearms. Just in the past couple of months, Congressman Eric Burleson said, the federal government has manipulated the National Firearms Act for nearly a century to strip Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. Unelected bureaucrats at the ATF have weaponized the NFA as a tool to criminalize millions of responsible gun owners. The recent pistol brace rule is the latest example of their audacious regard for the Constitution. In conclusion, I believe that the NFA is an infringement upon the Second Amendment because it sets a precedent that the government can pick and choose what activities the Second Amendment allows and disallows. If there are restrictions and bans placed upon our rights, then are those rights even guaranteed by the Constitution at all? As Americans, I also believe that the right and responsibility to bear arms is very important. The Second Amendment provides a way for free Americans to protect all of their constitutionally protected rights.